Hi, welcome again to Who's Who in Southern Alberta. Well, for those of you that have been watching the last few weeks, you probably know that we've started somewhat a new series based on the last book that came out in '88 on Who's Who in Southern Alberta, the many different people that make up this area from all walks of life. And today we're very pleased to have Dr. Gerald Ward. Hello, Doctor. I'll call you Gerald if you don't mind.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Although I don't know if I've ever met you too many times, I feel like I know you so well because I've heard so much about you over the years. And you know, I think a lot of us are envious of the fun you've had with the bicycle, for example. You know, we all sort of are outdoorsy a bit and have goals we want to have, but most of us never get around to fulfilling them. And you've done more than your share, haven't you? Tell us about your first bicycle trip. How you got involved in that?
Yes, the first major ride was when I graduated from UBC in 1936. And I was interested, this was in the midst of the Depression, when money was a very scarce item. And this seminary, which interested me, as a matter of fact, it's the largest seminary in the world. It has to be in Texas, of course, and it's in Fort Worth, yes. So and they had a standard reply for inquiries about finances was get $100 and a lot of faith and come on. And I was able to raise $100. And that was it. So then I had to have transportation, and the idea of riding the bike appealed to me. So I started out on the bike from Vancouver.
Had you ridden bikes a long way before?
Oh yes, I'd pretty well grown up on a bike. And through high school, I earned my way delivering telegrams. You know, we used to get 3 cents a piece for the telegrams.
Where was this? Where were you?
In Victoria.
Victoria.
Yes, for the CPR telegraphs. And then I was involved in bike racing too, because that was a very popular sport at the West Coast. So yes, I was quite at home on a bike, and it was a natural decision. Yes, I did the 2,500 miles. I slept on the road. I cooked my own meals, and the economy was rather different in those days. I bought 12 cobs of corn at a stand for 10 cents. I could get 3 loaves of 2-day-old bread for 10 cents. You know, and so I did it for $10.52.
Were there other people on the road on their bikes in those days? Or?
Well, you would meet them every now and again,
but not so much as it's been the last few years, I guess.
Oh no, it wasn't. Although I was offered 4 different jobs on the way down there in the midst of the Depression, and that was something.
Now once you made that trip and you got into the ministry and so on, and things became fairly conservative from the standpoint that you didn't find very many adults riding bicycles in the 40s and 50s. Did you continue on doing that?
Yes. I always had a bike, and I used it, more or less, but in the last 20, 25 years, I've become quite addicted to picking it up again, and have enjoyed it. Yeah.
Do you call this an addiction?
It becomes something like that, I think.
They have what they call the runner's high. Did you get the same sort of thing with the bicycle?
Oh yes, you do that, and the runner's wall too. When you're doing these long rides,
What's the runner's wall?
Well, that's when, you know, it takes that extra. That's when you experience a very satisfying pain. Because that's true. It does. And particularly the distance runners, they can all account. And sometimes, you know, end of the day when you've got 25 more miles to go, well, you hit something of the same thing. But really, there is a pain that you can experience that is very satisfying. Because it takes that extra, and if you're equal to doing it, it's, you can have that experience.
Now, I can remember one summer when I was doing a lot of work on the trails, and I came back after about 3 weeks, and I could hardly sleep at night. My legs seemed to want to still be going. Is this something that actually happens?
Yes, that's true. That's true.
And how do you get around that? You go out and cycle some more, is that it?
Well, once or twice but usually I was, particularly on this last ride, I was sufficiently pooped, you know, that I was out, and I really really could sleep. But I have had occasional, you know, cramps that can catch up to you in the middle of the night, and you have to get up and work them out. But when you do enough of it and you get accustomed to keeping your muscles supple, and it's possible to do that.
Now, I was never much of an athlete, so I never went through this, but you hear about people that as they go to older, they say, well, I can't do it as much as don't have the stamina and so on. Do you find that with yourself, that you just don't have the oomph?
You have to pace yourself, but I've been rather surprised, really, that I had the resources to keep up a good pace. When I did the Cross Canada ride, I was anxious to do it in the, you know, the best time that I could, make it a real challenge for anybody who wanted to come along afterwards. And so I set 110 miles a day, which is a fairly creditable distance.
I guess.
And was able to keep up with it.
Yeah. This was last summer, wasn't it?
Yes, I left Mile O in Victoria on May the 9th. And this was partly a nostalgic thing too, because 55 years ago I experienced call to ministry, and I was at Victoria College, and I started as a student in Chemainus on Vancouver Island. And I was there for a year and a half as a student while I was trying to gather resources to get on to university. And subsequently have served churches right across Canada, really, because I had a 9-year pastorate in St. Catharines, Ontario, and 7 years in St. John, New Brunswick. So the idea of the Pacific to the Atlantic, with a little visit to each of the churches I had served, added another dimension to that ride, and I was able to do that.
So you actually visited each of these churches that you were at?
Yes. Oh, yes, that was exciting.
And how many were there?
Well, including the student pastorates and 2 or 3 ministries, interim ministries, which I've had as a senior. There were 11. And so it took me off the direct route. I went north to Edmonton and Prince Albert, and then, of course, I went south to St. Catharines when I got into Ontario. So
now, when you're in the middle of Ontario, surely you're not going down the superhighway, are you?
I was on the Trans-Canada, and I stayed on the major highways as much as possible. Of course, 401, Queen Elizabeth, the bikes are prohibited.
Oh, I see.
So you have to find alternate routes, and it's a little bit of a problem sometimes. As a matter of fact, I did get on an illegal highway in Quebec, unintentionally, but I had escorts doing segments of this trip, people, relatives and friends whom I'd bullied into this.
Now, how do you mean they were doing segments? You mean they were riding with you, or?
Well, we kept in touch. They weren't tied down to that extent, but they had food and they had my suitcase, and so I'd meet them every 3 or 4 hours, and if they wanted to do some sightseeing, they could do that too. But yes, to do it in that time, it was necessary to have escorts, and of course I usually got away at 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and then would arrange they'd catch up to me at 9 o'clock when I'd be feeling the need for food again.
Did you ever have some scary situations, like people running you off the road?
Oh yes, yes, that's with you all the time, really, particularly. We're very fortunate with our highways here in the West, because the Trans-Canada, right through a major part of Ontario, they have gravel shoulders. And I had a triathlon racing bike with these 1-inch tires, 115 pounds of air, and if you hit the gravel, you can't stay upright. There's no way of maneuvering.
Were you on the gravel shoulders?
Well, I stayed on the highways, but sometimes you were forced into it.
Oh,
but,
I see.
Particularly if two semis were meeting right where you were. But I take my hat off to those truckers. Very often, a semi approaching, realizing what the situation, would go into the gravel on his side. And that's the last thing they want to do, and they don't want to slow down. No, I found them very courteous and very helpful.
Did you have a sign behind you so people knew what
Yes,
was
I
happening?
had, you see, it was a fundraising thing too, particularly Canadian Hunger Foundation, and then some denominational objectives, which I had. So this was featured, and the Hunger Foundation had put out 25,000 pamphlets, which the escorts carried and distributed them along. And yes, Mike Pisco made two aluminum signs which were attached to the carrier of my bike, indicating one, that the Hunger Foundation was a recipient of gifts, and a good deal of money came in for them. And on the other side, it featured the fact of touching the churches in 55 years of ministry from coast to coast. So it was sort of an eye catcher. And
was it on the bicycle, or was there a...
They were attached to the bike, yes.
I see. There was no backup vehicle behind you at
Well,
all.
the escorts had signs likewise, which they put on the windows of their cars, indicating the purpose of this too. Yeah.
Now, am I correct that following the last trip, you started to get some media attention down east from this?
Oh yes, and I suppose this started with Blaine Thacker when he learned of this ride, and I hadn't planned to go through Ottawa because I was majoring on the places I had served. And he said, oh, you have to go to Ottawa, you know. And he convinced me that Ottawa was a fairly important place. So I said, oh, that's okay. So he was in touch with George Hees, who was then the Secretary of State for seniors. And he had the idea that as his 78th birthday was approaching, that he would like to meet me and ride a distance with me into Ottawa with a police escort. But his knees gave him trouble, and he had to abandon that. But he was there at Parliament Hill to give the reception, and with Joyce Fairbairn and Blaine Thacker, they did a very nice job there, nice. And that got quite a bit of attention. And then CBC Radio in St. John, where I have quite a number of friends from my ministry there, and some of them real promoters. So they had set things up for the arrival in St. John. They had enough faith to believe that I would make it, you know. And so CBC had asked me to phone every second morning. So this was going out on the air, and whether people knew me or not, they knew that some character was making his way in that direction, you know. So they were sort of prepared for it. And a little story in connection with that. One of the times when I was talking, I just added, I said, well, I hope that one of my some of my former golfing buddies in St. John will have the forethought to set up a tee-off time for the morning after my arrival on the 23rd. And when I phoned the next time, they said we were hardly off the air before the pro out at the East Riverside golf course phoned and said that 3 of my peers had already set up, and there'd be luncheon at the club, courtesy luncheon, and so on. So, oh yes, and then the mayor of St. John, she is Mayor Elsie Wayne. She's very popular, and she was all ready to make the most of it too. And the first question she asked when I when I arrived at 2:30 on schedule at the City Hall, and she asked, well, have you ever kissed a mayor? And I said, well, no, I haven't, but maybe it's not too late to start. So I just had a really great welcome there, and it was kind of it was a great reception.
Okay, so of course the next natural thing to ask you is where next, because obviously you don't. It's no fun stopping at that point. You know, you want to keep going. So what's on the agenda for this summer?
I did have a thought in calling this one last year the grand finale, but nobody seems to believe that. Like
I think
yourself.
I've heard that somewhere along the line, or maybe it was the one a couple of years before that was the grand finale.
Yes. Well, I would like to do some more. Of course, this has to be worked out with my wife. It takes quite a while for her to build up enthusiasm for this this sort of thing. But there are a couple of parts of Canada that I have neglected, and I wouldn't mind doing a ride up into Alaska. I think that would be an awful lot of fun. And
You mean up the Alaska Highway?
yeah,
mean?
and then the what is it, the Liard Highway back.
Or you could do the Bering Strait into Siberia, down to Manchuria, across to Japan.
Incidentally, my escorts, a cousin from St. John, he and his wife came to Ottawa, and they did the last segment. And they became so enthusiastic about it. They said, if you'll come and do the Maritimes, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, do the whole bit, well, we'll be your escorts. So, you know, that's quite a temptation, too.
Oh, I'll say. Well, how would you, the Alaska Highway isn't paved, I don't think, is it?
That's a problem. When I did around the province, I had a couple of 100 miles of gravel, but I had to carry another bike for that.
Do you use a mountain bike for that? Or?
Mine wasn't a mountain bike, but I put heavy tires on my touring bike, and it did the job pretty well. But a mountain bike, of course, is ideal. Yes, at Terrace Bay, Ontario, there were about 15 teeners from one of the churches. They came out and met me and rode 10 miles. Every one of them had mountain bikes, and of course that you discover with that those gravel shoulders on the highways, the only way you can get out and go anywhere is with a mountain bike. Yes.
Now, another obvious question, and I'm sure the people out there are just dying to know. Would you tell us how old you are?
Oh, yes, I finished that ride before my 75th birthday, so I'll be 76 this July.
Oh, I'll bet you some of those teenagers couldn't keep up with you.
Well, some of them have been impressed along the way, yes.
I would think. Now, what do you do in the wintertime? Now, this has been kind of a tough winter for being on the highway. How did you manage that?
Yes, I have my touring bike is set up in the basement on rollers, and so I can ride that to my heart's content. But as I say,
how many miles do you put on down the basement?
Well, I haven't been keeping track of it this year, but normally I'll, I'll ride for half an hour, and in half an hour you can do 10 miles easily. Yeah.
You mentioned your wife. Does she have a bicycle? Does she go along with
No, she's not an enthusiast in this direction. She was great, she stayed home, of course, but it was on that cross-Canada ride, with particularly using so many different escorts, having a common telephone number, and of course I phoned every night, so that because you get off schedule and all sorts of things happen. So she was very good at coordinating things in that respect. When one reporter phoned her and asked what she did while I was riding all over the country, she said, "Oh, I stay home and act my age."
Well, I think this is one of the good things about what you do, is the fact that you show that everybody doesn't have to be from the same mold, so that everybody can sort of do their own contributions in their own way. You know, I think that's excellent. Yeah. But she never did ride a bicycle then on any of your trips?
No.
I see. Okay, now I imagine you've had how many calls this winter asking you what next summer's trip is going to be? Have they been bothering you all year? I bet.
Yes, yes. It so happens that I am part of a fairly large clan, and we have a family reunion every 4 years. And it will be in Alberta for the first time this summer. and the last weekend in July. So we are responsible for that, and so that has to take priority in our planning for this year. Anything else will be built around that.
I imagine you're going to ride your bike into this reunion.
Well, I'll have to do that. I'll have to do that, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, this has been really great, but before we get away, I'd like to hear about some of the other things that you do. You mentioned you're into history as well.
Well, it so happens that 42 years ago, I was named chairman of a committee which, in our denomination, which was set up with a view to establishing a leadership training school in Calgary, serving the four western provinces. Our convention covers the four western provinces. So I was able to get that underway, and it's become quite a successful venture. So this October will mark the 40th anniversary of its initiation, and we decided to put out a history. So I have been involved this winter in writing this history, and I'm just about...
Well, that's a lot of fun too.
Oh yes, and amazingly, I thought I knew all about it, but you know, you pick up... I spent 3 half days in the archives at McMaster University, and you can become really caught up in a thing like that, you know. There are just so many details that I had completely forgotten. And so that I found that very interesting, yeah.
Now, you brought up earlier that you were in Lethbridge, minister of the Baptist Church, back before the big fire.
Yes, I came in 1945, came from Prince Albert, as a matter of fact. And our church at that time was the former Knox Presbyterian Church, located right against the post office on the east side of the post office. And a lovely brick building, and we enjoyed it. We enjoyed it very much. It burned after we left in 1950. Yeah,
52,
53, January 53. Yeah. It burned. Yes.
Is this what brought you back, or how did you end up in Lethbridge again after all these other places?
Well, we had enjoyed Lethbridge very much. We had happy memories of Lethbridge. We liked the people, liked the size of the city, and we're in Calgary at the time, and I had always wanted to build a house. So we were visiting friends here in Lethbridge, and they were just opening Tudor Estates, and so we went over to look at and only about 10 houses there then, and it was probably partly emotional, but we made a deposit on a lot, and so before we knew it, I contracted the basement, and then we arrived here in September 1980, and so that first year I was involved in building a house, and that's, you know, if a person lives long enough, he's going to do one smart thing, and I think that was the smart thing that I did, because we've never regretted that.
Well, that's good.
Oh yes, we've enjoyed it, and then too, Velma was born in Texas. You see, I married at the seminary, and that was accounted for that second ride, really, because we were visiting the seminary, and when we had a family reunion in Texas, and that's when I was challenged to do it again 50 years later. And she thinks that, you know, this topography around here is more like Texas than any part of Canada she's seen. So that, of course, is the determining factor.
Oh, of course, of course. Well, thanks very much, and we've really appreciated this, and you know, there's a million other things we could talk about, I'm sure, but I'm sure the audience have enjoyed hearing about this, and they're just waiting. Sorry I couldn't scoop them on all the things that he's going to do next, but I'm sure he has some plans, and I'm sure we'll all hear about them. And thanks for coming, and thanks for paying attention to Who's Who in Southern Alberta. See you next week.
Thank you.
Welcome again to Who's Who in Southern Alberta. Well, have a guess. Who do you think this one is? Anybody you recognize? He's in the book, Who's Who in Southern Alberta. Let me just have a look here. Of course, it's Evan. Evan Gushel. I'm sure many of you know Evan. And he was here on a program a year or so ago. Maybe you'd like to take off that ridiculous-looking thing and tell us what it is.
Well, this ridiculous-looking thing is a welding helmet. It was my best friend when I welded in the tipple in Blairmore, in the coal mining tipple, and I welded with it many other places. And the other day we looked at the eclipse of the sun with it. It was a very, very useful article.
And what about the baseball hat you got turned around on your head?
Oh, well, this happens to be the skull cap. It's got the sweat liner inside of it, and I made this out of materials that Mr. Upton gave me from overcoat samples. They're pure wool, and it's the most comfortable thing you'd ever want to have.
Do you wear it quite often in the winter when you just go outside?
No, just strictly when the welding.
Oh, I see. Well, but you can see that this is your handiwork then, putting it all together.
Yeah, it's all hand-stitched, all fitted, and I've had that for, oh Lord, 40 years.
So your head hasn't changed the shape at all?
No, it hasn't.
That's good.
It's retained the same size.
You know, it's a man of many talents, from welding to this music. I don't know how you tie all these things together, but what is this thing?
Well, this is a mandolin. It's what we call a round-backed mandolin. It's one that I started playing on back in the 20s with my sister Nadia.
Oh, we have some pictures of that, I think. Okay. I wonder if we can get close-ups of some of these.
And this shows us the way we looked when we were youngsters and played in the orchestra in Coleman. Okay, we had what we call the Ukrainian school and the Ukrainian orchestra. We did our practicing and went to school in the Finnish Hall, which was in Bushtown, and our music teacher was a Polish fellow by the name of Patik, which translates to stick. And he did conduct with a stick, and he kept discipline with it very well. He was a very strict man, but he was a good teacher. He was a kind man, but he was a good teacher.
What's Bushtown?
Bushtown is East Coleman. Okay, there's two parts to Bushtown, or to East Coleman. The one part is just across the track, and then the other part is across the river. And the Finnish Hall just happened to be the first building over the bridge across the river into the, well, I guess you could call it the Easter part of Bushtown. But that was a favorite place.
Now these are some orchestras that you were involved in. You were telling me earlier.
This was the Crow's Nest Pass Symphony, and Mr. Moser basically started the orchestra in 1929, actually 1927. I played in it since 1929, and my sister Praska still plays in it. And this picture was taken in the studio in Blairmore.
And you're talking about the Gushel studio?
This is the Gushel studio, which is a historical site now. And this orchestra, as you see, full complement, practiced in that studio for several years. The thing I want to point out on this is we have two conductors here. When Mr. Moser conducted it, it was Moser's orchestra. And when Mr. Upton conducted it, it was Upton's orchestra. Now, the same people played. The only thing that happened was the conductors traded places. Each conductor played for the other one on the cello. And they were very good in both capacities, as a cellist and as a conductor. But when the adjudicators gave their remarks about our orchestras playing set pieces, Upton's orchestra would play it slightly differently than Moser's, and yet it was the same people involved in it.
And can you give us a reason as to why it was this way?
I think it's the different type of charisma or different vibes that each conductor projected, and with that, they got something different out of us. So, they tuned into another part of our own vibrations, you know, and We played a certain way for Mr. Upton, we played a different way for Mr. Moser.
That's interesting.
And yet their interpretation of the same piece had a slight variance.
Unconsciously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, this Moser you're talking about, that's the father of the fellow that
Right.
runs the which newspaper is it?
The past promoter in Blairmore. And this is Teddy, right here, that's playing the violin. That's when he was a young fellow. And he's a very accomplished violinist himself.
Oh, is that right?
And
All right. What else have we got here? Oh, here's a picture.
now, that's the old Columbus Hall where we used to hold the music festivals. And this shows the old ornate stage, and it's fairly well attended here. But on the final nights, there'd hardly be standing room. The people really patronized it, and it was patronized both from the point of view of spectators, who mainly would have been the parents, but also in the participants. Every child who played an instrument pretty well took part in a festival at one time or another. And I think the main satisfaction that we can feel about it now is that we played in the festival. Whether you came second, first, last, or whatever, didn't matter, but you took part in something that was wonderful and gave meaning to living in the past.
What about, you're giving me the impression that everything is roses, everybody gets along. We know it was a melting pot of a lot of different cultures. Was it really that way, or was it?
I would say that the melting pot idea was something that existed very, very tangibly, you might say. We had many races there, and yet there wasn't any of this business that we see now.
Oh, is that right?
It really was on a, how shall we say, a non-existent scale almost.
It wasn't like early Lethbridge where there was the north side and the south side and...
Oh, that part, division-wise, okay, in Coleman you had your divisions that were very, very well marked. Starting with West Coleman, which was called Slavtown, that's where most of the Slavonic people settled. Okay, when you came east around the road, around that bluff, you came across this very, very high rocky bluff. And the Italian people settled in that, so they called that Italian Town. And when you think about it and realize the people who settled there came from a similar area in Italy. And in Blairmore we had an area just up along at the base of the Turtle Mountain, which was settled the same way into a kind of a rocky hillside. And they made use of that rock. They're fantastic masons, these people. You know, they can build that so beautifully. And then when you went into the main part of town, of course there was the business section, right opposite the coke ovens and the mining operation. And there were a few residences just farther back from the main street. And then when you went up on the hill, you had more of the English and Scottish people that settled there. And when you went eastward along that hill, you came to a place they called Grafton Town, and that was settled almost primarily by English people.
I see.
And the east part of town and south was bush town, and in the early days that was a heavy bush area, practically a swamp, but it had a willow bush growing in it, you see. And as time went on, this was drained, and there you found a lot of the Polish and Ukrainian people settled in there.
What do you think of this Echo Museum type of plan that they have now?
Well, I don't know much about it as yet. I know that the museum proper in the old school is being developed in a very, very efficient manner. And I don't know anything about the Echo Museum as yet.
Does it bother you that all that gold is there and you didn't get any when you were there?
No, not really, because when it comes down to it, you can't even pick it. You know, you can't pick at it or pick it out. It's not a vein of gold as you would find in quartz, but it's the particles that have come into that kind of a foamy rock. And I think it's going to be a hard thing to process out. You may have to use the cyanide method in that to dissolve it and then precipitate it out.
Are you a pessimist that all this is media hype, or what do you think?
Well, I think it's going to be a very expensive process to put into action, because the chemistry now is far more expensive than it was years and years ago. In Australia, they use the same method of extracting the gold out of different ores and that, when they would pulverize it, and about the most efficient way chemically to get it out, get 100% of it out of the rock, was by dissolving it out and then precipitating the solution.
Did you know there was gold all over there?
No, no, that came as a total either shock or surprise.
How about the Lost Lemon Mine? You just had that figured out as a...
Well, the Lost Lemon, according to the legend, is supposed to contain nuggets and free gold, pure gold, you see. And this doesn't bear any resemblance to that at all. And I think, of course, there have been 2-3 people. One of the Kropanak boys has done hundreds and thousands of test holes all through that back area, you know, into the mountains there. And I don't think it's yielded anything.
Yeah, I see. Well, it's an interesting
It's
story.
interesting,
and they're getting
though.
lots of publicity.
I think the true gold is probably, it could be the resurgence or reopening of the mines, and putting out a pure product that would sell well, have a good market.
Yeah, yeah.
That might be the gold.
Before we forget and run out of time, would you like to play that, a few bars on that mandolin you called it?
Okay.
Let's have, let's hear what it does. You know, that sounds a lot to me like a banjo.
Very much.
How does it differ from a banjo, other than it looks good?
Well, the banjo has a skin on it,
Yeah.
and it gives a kind of a more percussive tone. And this has a slightly mellower tone.
Now, what's the background of that? Is that a Ukrainian instrument?
No, it's basically, I believe, I would give the Italians credit for that. I think they made the first mandolins. Now, I can be totally wrong on that, but in my experience, I've seen more mandolin music come out of Italy. But the Ukrainians took to this in that they had the orchestra. We also had a couple of Italian people playing in that same orchestra. We had guitars, mandocellos, mandolins, mando basses, you know, and the folk.
Mando basses? Okay. Well,
That's
pretty big to hold, isn't it?
Well, you stand them up and you slap at them.
This isn't like a...
But it's a fretted instrument in that sense. And the Ukrainian orchestra that came out from Winnipeg many years ago, I think we had a picture of it that other time, they put out some beautiful, beautiful music with that setup.
Now, before we run out, we have to hear the violin, and tell us about the Royal Purple.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see what's happened. In honor of the royal visit in 1939, I rehaired this bow with white hair, of course, but I dyed it purple.
After you put it on, or before?
No, before, during the washing process. And
Hope you told the Queen that you had done this, did you?
well, no. We followed the royal visit very closely. I even took pictures off the movie screens with this little camera that I had built, and somewhere's in my collection I've got negatives showing their visits across Canada, you know, and it was interesting. These pictures of taken at the festival, like this one here, was taken with that camera that I built. The other one that my father took with a standard camera.
You actually built the camera.
Mm-hmm. I took the lens off our 16 millimeter movie camera.
Okay.
It's a 1.9 1-inch lens, and I built a camera that was able to give me 48 pictures on a vest pocket roll, 8 exposure vest pocket roll. I would run 24 in the one direction. Each number was exposed 3 times, you see, and the images were roughly 3/4 of an inch square, the photographic area. And with that, I turned the film around, taped the loose end, and ran it through from number 8 to number 1, and I had 48 pictures that way.
I should mention that besides being an accomplished musician, he was also a bug photographer, right? You worked at the research station for a number of years.
22.5 years.
And you specialized in insects. Would that be correct?
That's one of them back there.
Okay, I'll pick up the picture. You just give us a little tweet on
Well,
the...
first I'll give you the same tune. When we moved to Rocky Mountain House, when I was working in that welding shop, we had a Norwegian neighbor, Hjalmar Ottesen. And he spotted this violin in the case, and right away he just had to play it. So he grabbed the bow. I haven't got the heart to do it that way. But anyway, he grabbed it there and he put the violin under his chin, which was down here someplace, and ready.
That's
He
lovely.
went off like that, and oh, it just made everything stand up.
Beautiful. I was a bit worried there for a while. Trust me. All right, here's some of the... These aren't bug pictures. Oh, here's the bug picture. Okay. This is one you did when you were at the research center?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it's a bee fly, it says.
Bee fly on a composite flower, and of course it's getting pollen here, and that's taken with a 35 millimeter camera, and I used negative color film on that particular one. A lot of the pictures that I took in this category, I took on slide film, and they were entered as slides in many competitions and that, and for the purpose of our own work, often we would make, if it were for publication, say a black and white publication, we would make a 4x5 Interneg in black and white from that and make the prints from that. But the equipment that was used would be a 35 millimeter single lens reflex camera, bellows with a 105 millimeter short mount lens, and a flash, electronic flash. And to ease the taking in some of the circumstances, I made a frame finder. It was a little rod that had a U-frame at the other end. It was precisely focused that all you had to do is get that insect within that U and fire away. You didn't have to look through a finder.
I see. Now we should mention your father was a well-known photographer in the past, and his studio.
My father was in the photographic business from 1909 to pretty well till the time that he died, to within a couple of weeks in 1962.
And it was a very unique building, the studio with glass coming through the, what do you call it, skylight?
The skylight and the north light, the vertical window, the vertical wall is all glass, and the skylight, which is at about a 45-degree angle. It's the only building of its kind, so far as some people tell us, west of Toronto.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. This was
Hand-colored. My father would go out the day before and take these pictures. I would be with him, and make up the prints overnight. And then he would take me out to that same location the next day with my colors. I'd have my oils and my brushes and everything, and I would do the coloring right on the spot, so that the correct color is in the right place in each case.
And when did they stop doing this type of coloring?
Excuse me. Well, we did it for quite a while, and there wasn't very much of it being done, I would say, from the mid-50s, because color printing was coming into its own then, you see. And many people still prefer to have their portraits done by us, and which, in fact, I worked on one here not too long ago where I did the coloring in 1942. This chap was in the Air Force at the time, and had his picture taken before he went overseas. He was a flying officer. And after the war was over, he went into the Army, and then he went into the Indian Department work.
Oh, yeah.
And I photographed him as an Indian chief, and I photographed him in his retired Army uniform as well, and I've made a composite of the three pictures. But I had to try to match up with modern color material what we had done in the 40s. And the comparison isn't fair, really. You get a truer rendition, like say this portrait of this little girl here. It's a far truer portrait than what you could get with modern color materials. We come close, but it's not. We have to compromise. That's what life is, a series of compromises, you know.
You're a philosopher too, eh? Good. And this is colored the same type.
And this is a little corner in Frank, just west of the playgrounds. And it's always beautiful in the fall, especially when the leaves are sparkling and bright.
Well, what else? Do you do painting as such, with the palette and the brush?
The painting that I've done is in the restoration of the odd painting that has been damaged. You see, and I'll duplicate the artist's strokes, colors, and everything, and salvage the painting, repair the canvas, and do that type of work, and repair frames. I had to do one where the filigree, metal filigree, cast filigree was broken off, and I had to cast new pieces and fit them in and engrave them out to make them match.
Now you brought some of your tools here.
The tools that I brought there, when you're hooked up there, are some of the tools that I use in repair work on violins.
Corny Martins, if you're listening, he fixes old violins. There's an Indian story on one of our shows where I made a plaque out of a violin I had and put a hole in the back of it. He was very upset about that.
I don't blame him.
So this is stuff you use just to fix violins. So if somebody has an old violin there, you can make it into a Jim Dandy. Is that right?
Well, I've done a lot like that. This is the way you'd use this clamp when you've taken the top table off and re-gluing it. When you put it back on, you clamp it down. You have a whole series of these going all around the violin. And I made up several dozen of these. It takes about 30 to 32 to go around the average violin, you see. And they're expandable to where they'll take in a viola as well. And for cellos, I have a set of these Judd clamps that are self-adjusting or quick adjusting, and I can just clamp on and they open up to good 6 inches. 6 inches or better.
Now, where would you buy these tools? Do they?
Well,
you just sort of collect them over the
I'm
years?
glad you asked it that way, because this one you can't buy anywhere.
I have a clothes hanger like that at home too.
Oh, this is and let's see, one of these is haywire anyway. But when I was in the Army, I lent this violin out to somebody that came from the other squadron. I didn't know them at all. And when I got it back, the sound post had been pushed up, the neck had been broken off, it was just all smashed. Somebody sat on it. And they also stole all my strings out of the case and just brought me back the violin. So that was a disaster. But I felt very, very disappointed. And so I got some LePage's glue and found some haywire on the premises. It was hard to find, by golly. And I fastened a sound post setter. Now with this, when you're putting the final touches on, you set the sound post in. That's the little dealie that's in there. And you insert it from this side, and with a little bit of pressure, you find the right spot for it, and you pressure on the top table. You just sort of squeeze it down there gently. It has to be put in with just enough pressure that it'll just stand up, and if you do that to it, it should fall down. That's without any strings on. And you try that out, you string it up and try it, and listen to the tone and make whatever adjustments you need. Now, for pushing the sound post over, you use this part, and for pulling it,
Oh, I see.
you hook it in there, you see. Now, this is a factory-made one here. Actually, it's handmade, but it comes,
You buy
and
those.
it's done
Yeah.
a little differently. It's not as flexible as this, in that, but it serves the same purpose.
I see, right. Except it costs more money.
And when you're doing some repairs, I'll leave that there, inside, often you don't want to take the top table off, so you use a mirror like this in there, and you can put buttons or little cleats across the crack. And you can do all that with mirrors and with these.
If you have the patience.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the other tool that's used for setting a post.
You want me to step on the violin for you and
Well,
make it more...
You wouldn't hurt my feelings too much, because all I would do is just put it back together again. No, I don't get upset about that.
That's good.
It's not a disaster. To some people it would be, but not to me. This is the little forceps-like thing that you use to move that post. Instead of using that particular tool, you look in there and you get that, and you'll just juggle that post. Before you juggle anything, I wouldn't juggle it on this with the string tension on, because that's a tremendous pressure on there. You loosen the strings and do the adjusting, try it again, and then see how it works.
Well, we've run out of time, but before we leave, maybe you could serenade us out, if you don't mind. Let me just give one short explanation as what's going on. We've been listening to Evan Gushel tell us about the many facets of his interesting life, and he's just one of many people to be found in the latest edition of Who's Who in Southern Alberta. So Evan, would you like to play as we fade into the sunset?
Okay.
See you next week.